Chapter 25 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Shirking Responsibility. Her husband's communication had filled Mrs. Coleman with astonishment. She had, it is true, been the prime factor in bringing about this change in his business, but she did not realize it. The simple fact is that Jennie Coleman had been one of those girls, and had become one of those women, who did not realize anything. Individual responsibility was a question that she had not studied. She had married, as many another has, without any distinct idea of the responsibilities of married life. Take, for instance, that one question, money, which really from first to last is productive of more evil, perhaps, than any other domestic question under the sun. And when Jennie Coleman assumed her place in life as a matron, what did she know about it? Her father called himself poor, and her life had been a struggle, she believed, with poverty. But her idea of struggling was to coax her father, and in later years her mother, until she succeeded in making them realize that she must buy the things she wanted, or must go to the place she selected, or must do the things she pleased. And once convinced, the money was forthcoming somehow. Why should it not be the case in her married life? Her father had always been managed. Why should not her husband need management? She utterly ignored, or to do her justice, she never understood, the difference between a man of business, who, though it may press him hard, and he may think the demand unnecessary and therefore foolish, can nevertheless secure a few $100s additional, and push through from year to year, and a young clerk whose entire resources are covered by his monthly salary, and who can no more command an additional 100 or two than he can command an extra pair of hands to meet his emergencies. Utterly failing to recognize this difference, of course Mrs. Coleman had seen trouble, and trouble in various forms was deepening around her. She was opening her eyes daily to the fact that her marriage was a sickening failure. Her husband did not satisfy her, and it was a humiliating truth that she evidently did not satisfy him. Did she then really love her husband? Or, to go back of that, had she ever loved him? In all honesty and solemnity, I have to answer no. I do not think she ever had. She admired him, she liked him, she was fascinated by his faultless manners and careful dress, and marked admiration of herself, and she labeled these feelings love, when she ought to have known that genuine love is both unselfish and discriminating. He, on his part, reached but very little higher in his views and feelings, except that he fancied himself ready to give her all he could, to take upon himself the responsibility of her support, to labor for her from day to day. In short, he realized, of course, that he was giving, and at times at least was willing to give, while she realized that she was accepting, and stood at all times ready to accept, whatever he could be prevailed upon to give her. Oh, I realize my own failure in trying to put this difficulty, that is as old as the world, into words. It is an oft-told story. I tell you, the excitement of the opera or theater, or of fashionable party life, do not fit people to make wise, deliberate, unselfish choices for life's journey. These two people had met each other 100 times, when they were well dressed and in society, and doing their best to shine. It was actually almost all they knew of each other until they met in that shabby genteel boarding-house, bound to be companions, in hours when neither felt like making the slightest effort to shine in any way. Well, was the shipwreck which they were making of it absolutely necessary even then? No, oh no. Utter shipwreck of human happiness is rarely, thank God, a necessity, even though grievous blunders have been made. If Jennie Coleman had but begun her married life as a Christian woman, recognizing the responsibilities that she had assumed before God, resolved to struggle with her faults, resolved to bear with the faults of her husband, False and foolish as her ideas of married life were, she would have saved her heart from ruin, and possibly have been the human means of saving her husband's soul. But the greatest pity about it all was, that she professed what her keen-eyed husband came to believe she did not possess, or, almost worse conclusion still, if she did possess it, he wanted none of it. And so, starting from narrow and selfish points, and dropping lower in the scale each day, at this time barely 14 months since they stood together at the altar and pledged each other in irrevocable vows, this husband had come to believe that what his wife wanted was money, however earned she did not care, money with which she could dress well, and ride where she chose, and have a good time generally, with him for an unexceptionable attendant. And she believed that what he wanted was to spend his money on himself, shutting her out. And both believed that to have gone their separate ways would have made them happier. And it was still their individual happiness, and nothing else, that both were eagerly after. What but misery could there be in store for them? It seems now to be necessary to give you a careful view of this sudden change of business. Unlike Mr. and Mrs. Evans, this couple, in their parental homes, had come up under the shadow of a staunch temperance, or rather total abstinence, regime. Both grandfathers had been pioneers in the temperance movement, in the days when to be openly connected with such movements required heroism. The next generation on Jenny's side, it is true, had weakened a little, but still her father held strongly enough that to be connected in any sense with the making or selling of intoxicants was a very low social position. While Will Coleman had reason to feel as though his long-dead father would rise out of his grave, if he could, to rebuke his son for laxness in this matter. Now you may understand what a leap downward the change of business was. Down lower, it is true, for the man than for the woman, because he covered his position with no foolish subterfuges, such as brains can see through in a moment. He fully realized that he was connecting himself with the liquor traffic. But he realized also another thing, and it was this which increased his bitterness, that his wife would see the increased salary more plainly than she would anything else, and would make no opposition. Neither did she, to him, beyond that first startled question over which he had laughed in sarcasm. Then she gave herself up to what she told herself was the inevitable. Will always does exactly as he likes. I have no influence with him. And she dressed herself carefully, and set out on the pleasant task of looking up a more congenial boarding-place, better suited to their increased means. It was when the plans connected with their removal were nearly completed that Mrs. Evans came to call. Jenny went very slowly downstairs, glad of the confusion in her room, which prevented receiving her cousin there, and hoping that the parlor would be so occupied as to afford no chance for a tete-a-tete, not choosing meantime to define to herself the reason why she desired to avoid a private interview. There were many things in life which Jenny Coleman might have seen had she chosen to look at them. Her hopes were vain, the parlor was deserted, and Mrs. Evans occupied the little tete-a-tete alone. Mrs. Coleman, resolved on taking the defensive at once, explained that her room was so dismantled by reason of preparations for moving that it was not habitable. "Then it is true," said Mrs. Evans eagerly. "I heard you were going to move. Where do you go, and why? Oh, Jenny, I hope that the rest of what I heard is false." Mrs. Coleman, ignoring the latter part of this sentence, calmly and not without evident satisfaction, explained that they were about to go to the Central Avenue boarding-house, that they were to have a room on the second floor, larger and in every way pleasanter than the one they were leaving, and that it would be in every way an advantage to them. The class of boarders was superior, the style of the house unexceptionable, and, besides, it would be so much more convenient for Will. Oh, then it is true that he is going into Fargo and Belmont's employ." The exceeding disappointment in her cousin's tones was very apparent. "I didn't believe it when I heard the report. It seemed unlike Will. Oh, Jenny, how could you let him do it?" "What are you talking about?" said Mrs. Coleman, her face flushing, but struggling to retain a composed, good-natured voice. "I should think it was a subject for congratulation that we were to have as much again income. We have certainly demonstrated the impossibility of living respectably on the small sum that we had. As for letting Will do it, you ought to know by this time how certain a man is to do as he pleases without regard to a woman's advice. I did not know the least thing about this matter until it was all settled." She was not prepared for the sudden, pleased light in Mrs. Evans's eyes. "Did you not?" she said, still speaking eagerly. "I am so glad to hear it. I was afraid you had been tempted to yield to it because of the salary, but now you are in a position to protest. I am sure, Jenny, that you can influence Will. It is for your sake he is so anxious to secure a larger income. Most men care for money only on account of their family. I think Will is peculiarly one of that kind. See for how many years he has been content to work away in the store. He is thought so much of there, too. Dane says there is a certainty of his being promoted in time. Oh, you will find that you can influence him. In fact, Jenny, I believe he will be relieved and thankful to see you are unwilling to have him make more money at the expense of conscience. He has told Dane more than once how it chafed him to think that he could not give you the position in society that you were fitted to take. Now, when he finds that you care more for his highest interests than for any position which the world can offer, he will not only be influenced but touched." It was a long speech for Mrs. Evans to make. She was not a woman of many words, you will remember; and Jenny, in the midst of her embarrassment, not to say indignation, felt a sense of wonderment over the excitement and eloquence of her quiet cousin. Still she answered with impatience. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't soar into the heroic quite so much, talking about Will's higher interests and all that nonsense. I assure you he is no more fond of poverty than I am, and has chafed under it quite as much. As for promotion, he has been contented to plod along on the strength of that long enough. I am glad for my part that he has had the manliness to arouse himself and make a better provision for his family, though I am sure I did not urge him to do it." "But, Jenny, why don't you urge him against it? How can you endure it to have him engage in such a business as that?" "Really!" And Mrs. Coleman's laugh was almost as disagreeable as the one her husband had recently cultivated. "That is a very strange way to talk when one remembers that you and Dane have been living on the same business for years. Your horror is decidedly extreme, I should say, considering the recoil from it has been so recent." "It isn't quite the same position, Jenny. Dane was only a bookkeeper." Mrs. Evans's voice was lower, and the flush on her cheek had deepened. Mrs. Coleman did not realize what a fresh impulse she had given to her cousin's hatred of the business by this home thrust, nor how thankful she grew over the fact that now at least she was free from the stain. "Oh, that is all nonsense," declared Jenny, loftily. "No one but a child would think of making such distinctions. Dane was just as much connected with the sale of liquor as Will be. Only Will's position is one of greater trust, and his salary higher." "But," declared Mrs. Evans, "Dane is free from it now, you know, forever. I heartily wish he had been long ago. I take shame to myself that my eyes were not wider open." "He is free from everything that is calculated to support you, I should judge, from all I hear. What is he doing for a living?" Perhaps Mrs. Evans would not have been human, had not the blood rushed violently even to her very temples, at this cold home thrust. But she answered still with a quiet voice. "He has not found any position as yet, but of course he hopes to very soon. Meantime, we are not suffering, and we have grand friends." "Living on charity! I suppose as much. I wonder what your mother would think of that. Well, Eva, I must say I think that you and Dane are two fools. That is plain language, I know, but the occasion demands it. The idea of his giving up a clerkship that he has held so many years, for the sake of a passing whim suggested to him by other people. I'm sure if Will were as much influenced by the opinion of other women as Dane is, I should be sorry for him. The idea of Dane trying to follow Callie Spafford through all her fanatical absurdities is simply ridiculous, and you will see it in that light one of these days. I should never have believed that you would be such an idiot. If anything would drive Will into the very midst of the business, it is to see you and Dane shrinking in such fanatical horror from it, actually willing to be dependent on the charity of your poor neighbors." I do not know that Mrs. Evans said a word more than she had meant to say when she left home that afternoon, provided there should be occasion for such plainness of speech. But I think she may have said it more suddenly, and less tenderly, than, but for this strong provocation, she might have done. Her voice was still low, but it was the sort of lowness that betokens intense self-control. "Jenny, we need not discuss my husband's prospects or fanaticism. If his recent step was demanded of him by his conscience, God can take care of the results. He and I are both willing to trust our future in God's hands. But there is an entirely different question involved in your husband's position. Aside from a question of right or wrong, is it possible that you do not know what everybody else sees, that it is placing Will right in the line of his most awful temptation? Don't you know that the habit of drinking freely is growing on him every day, and that he is in awful danger of becoming a drunkard? Jenny Coleman, you might almost wish to see him buried, rather than launched on such a whirlpool as that into which he is entering. I came this afternoon to beg of you to use your influence to save him. I know you can do it." Now was Mrs. Will Coleman angry, more angry than she ever remembered being in her life before. She arose from her seat, and came over to where her cousin was sitting, and stood over her, her eyes blazing like two stars, and spoke in slow, measured tones. "Mrs. Evans, excuse me for saying that I think you have made your call of sufficient length, and I decline talking with you any longer, or receiving further calls from you. When a woman stoops to the act of insulting another woman's husband, incited thereto by a feeling of petty envy because her own husband has been a fool, and because the other is a rising business man, I think it is quite time that those two women should become strangers. You have chosen to uphold your husband in a piece of lazy folly. I hope you will not starve in consequence. Indeed, we will see to it, my slandered husband and I, that you do not actually suffer want. But as for being cousins any longer, or friends, I have no desire to claim the position." Then she gathered her silken robes about her, and sailed majestically out of the room. As for Mrs. Evans, she did just what you might suppose her to do next. She burst into tears, and sunk in a little crushed heap on the sofa in that great deserted parlor. Only a few minutes for crying. Then she arose, dried her eyes, rearranged her disordered bonnet as best she could, very thankful that the parlor was deserted, let herself out at the front door, hailed a passing car, and went home. What about the angry woman? Well, she too cried as soon as she reached her room. Angry tears. She had not the slightest idea of using her influence with her husband to alter his business arrangements. Do her justice, she did not believe she had influence enough to cause him to change his plans. At least, not now, after they had been announced to the world, and the new business all but entered upon. Also, do her justice to understand that she did not believe a word of the warning. Will took an occasional glass of wine. She was sorry for that. She had been surprised, years ago, that the son of such a temperance worker as his father had been, should be, ever so rarely, a wine drinker. but she did not believe that the habit was growing on him. She did not in the remotest degree fear his ever being a drunkard. The idea! When his grandfather had been a hero in the temperance world 50 years ago. Besides, Will was a gentleman, she still believed it. He would never be a common drunkard. What unparalleled impudence it was to hint it to her, his wife. But, being a wife, why did she not recoil in terror from the bare suspicion of it, as it was hinted by other people, and throw her influence powerfully in the scale to prove its falsity? Oh dear! Here, as in every other moment of her life where plain seeing was needed, there was a glamour over Jennie Coleman's eyes. The simple fact is, that in her girlhood she had been, just as often as she could bring it about, an attendant at the theatre. She had wept over spurious woes and spurious ruins so often. She had rejoiced over sham heroic deeds so many times. She had applauded mimic virtues so much that nothing anywhere seemed quite real to her. She had, besides, a dangerous talent for the dramatic. It hovered over even her angry talks with her husband, and made her almost insensibly take the tragic air and manner of some favorite actress. And it is an actual fact that, real as her anger was that day, intense as she supposed her feeling of wifely indignation to be while she answered Mrs. Evans's warning, she was tormented with the suggestion that her words were wonderfully well chosen, her manner excellent, and that the entire scene would have appeared exceedingly well on the stage. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Measuring Enthusiasm. Many a woman who is the fortunate slave of a young tyrant at home will be in a condition to sympathize with the frantic haste which Mrs. Spafford made on a certain Tuesday afternoon, in order to be on time at the missionary meeting downtown. An annual gathering, and one of special interest. Young Warren had so monopolized his mother for past months that she had missed several of the regular meetings, and therefore felt lost, or at least behind the times, and was particularly anxious to secure this entire afternoon. Notwithstanding the unceremonious way in which she disposed of her toilet, and the skilful quick step in which she went to the car, she was late and breathless when at last the usher tiptoed with her down the aisle of the well-filled church. Somebody was reading, and embarrassed as she was by her haste and tardiness, she paused suddenly as she heard a voice whisper her once familiar name. "Oh, Callie Howell!" Whose voice could that be? It sounded to her like a dream from out a long-gone past. She gazed about her bewilderedly, then advanced doubtfully a few steps, and felt her dress gently twitched by somebody in the side aisle. Whose face was that? Where had she seen it? Was this a dream, or had she dropped back 10, 15, nearly 20 years into her early childhood? She took the seat made for her by systematic crowding, and held out her hand mechanically to receive the energetic grasp of somebody. "Have you forgotten all about Sally Lewis?" a voice whispered. Sally Lewis! Why, no, she remembered her. She was a young lady with curls and sweet blue eyes, a Sabbath school teacher, her teacher, and the little girls, herself included, used to call her their "dear Miss Sally." Yes, but that was 20 years ago. Miss Sally grew old, of course, married, went away. Where did she go? Oh, yes, she married a minister. Went to India or China or somewhere. Mrs. Spafford had not thought of her for a dozen years, but all these events came crowding back upon her memory, called up by that whispering voice. Then she turned and looked fully at the lady. There were no curls, The fair, rosy cheeks were sallow and wrinkled, but the soft blue eyes were bright and smiling. "Yes, I am Sally Lewis," she whispered, squeezing Mrs. Spafford's hand and indulging in a softly laugh, "and you are my dear little roly-poly Sabbath school rosebud, Callie Howell. You are not changed so very much after all. Tropical sunshine hasn't burned all the fairness out of you, you see." Just then came the voice of prayer, and both ladies bowed their heads, and Mrs. Spafford had time to call back her startled thoughts and realize that she was living in the present, and the sweet-faced, worn woman beside her was really her old-time teacher, a returned missionary. She felt a sudden accession of honor. She was richer in friends than she had remembered. She studied the quiet face beside her furtively during the reading of the reports which followed, trying to see in this middle-aged and unmistakably careworn woman a photograph of their beautiful and idolized Miss Sally. It was hard to do. She had evidently borne much of the heat and burden of the day. Her youthful freshness was long since gone, and in its place had come many lines of care. "I have forgotten her name, or, let me see, did I ever know her husband's name? What a shame not to have kept within view of her work, and she my old teacher." This was Mrs. Spafford's mental comment while the reading of the reports went on. At last she bent toward the lady, who still clasped her hand with the tenderness that the child, Callie, remembered of old. "I don't know your name?" she whispered. Then the blue eyes that she remembered well flashed upon her a touch of their old archness, as she spoke a name well known in missionary circles, and recognized instantly by Mrs. Spafford. She had actually read extracts from her letters in public meetings, and had never known that she was quoting from Sally Lewis. "Oh, I didn't mean that," she whispered back instantly. "I know your name very well indeed. I mean, I don't know you. Why, I mean—" And then both ladies laughed. It was all so curious. Then directly, of course, they sat erect and gave serious attention to those reports. The idea of two middle-aged ladies laughing in a religious meeting, and one of them a returned missionary! Great as was her eagerness to have a little talk with her old friend, Mrs. Spafford could not but become interested in what was soon transpiring around her. The reports were inspiriting. The accession of members had been large, the new auxiliaries many, during the past year, and the treasurer's report so far surpassed anything that they had had before, and anything that had been expected, that the ladies clapped their gloved hands with energy before its reading was concluded. Then several of the speakers seemed endowed with the very spirit of Christ that afternoon, so simply eloquent were their appeals, so telling the incidents which they had to relate of sacrifice and progress and reward. Peculiarly was this the case with Mrs. Temple's closing address. Her heart was more than ever aglow. She had prepared herself carefully, not so much with many statistics as with a few facts, which she told in such a manner as to bow many heads and bring to the surface real heart tears. Mrs. Spafford, listening to her, rejoicing with her in the progress of the cause, had nearly forgotten the honor of her own position in sitting beside one who had actually lived the experiences to which Mrs. Temple was referring, until some reference to the field in which she labored made her turn suddenly toward her friend for sympathy. She was amazed and distressed to discover that not a trace of sympathetic feeling could be found on her face. She sat erect, composed and almost indifferent. Nay, there was worse than indifference on her face. There was just the shadow of a smile hovering around her mouth, and actually a sarcastic curve to the upper lip. The very curve which Callie Howell as a child remembered when something had occurred to arouse her bright young teacher's opposition. What could be the explanation? Mrs. Spafford felt a cold chill at her heart, and turned her head quickly, and was so absorbed by her painful wonderings that she forgot to join in the solemn doxology which presently filled the house. The shadow of her discovery embarrassed her, so that when the meeting formally closed, and the missionary turned eagerly toward her, she knew not what to say. "Why didn't we hear from you this afternoon?" was her first wonderment put into words. "Oh, I am to speak this evening at the Union meeting," she said indifferently. "I am glad to be relieved from duty this afternoon. Talking doesn't signify, we have too much of that. What we want is living." "Of course," assented Mrs. Spafford. "But most of those who talk at this meeting are living, too. Do you know Mrs. Temple? You will know her, of course. She is very prominent in this work, and such a grand woman. Oh, Sally, how you must miss such gatherings as these, with sympathetic Christian women all around you. I never realized it so much before. But what a heavy cross it must be to give up all such helps." "Do you think so?" the returned missionary said, and there was a strange light in her eyes. "It does not impress me in that way. I wouldn't live in this country again for anything. It seems to me I should suffocate." Her cheeks were glowing, and her whole manner indicated intense feeling. Her listener stood aghast. "I can't think what you mean," she murmured. "Of course you do not want to give up your work, I can understand that, and of course it is a blessed work. But I thought there were sacrifices to make." "There are, but they do not come to me in the way that you have indicated. I'm not sure that I can make my meaning plain. You don't know how it impresses me, all this, and oppresses me. I feel as though you were all playing at missions. Think of the papers that have been read here this afternoon, and the addresses that have been made. Every one of them referred to sacrifices, and rejoiced over the thought of being counted worthy to bear the cross for him. Bah! Pardon the expression, but it makes me sick. What have they ever sacrificed for him? What do they know of the meaning of the word? Look around you on every side. Do you see any evidence of retrenchment? I am very familiar with that word. It has been rung at us in all its changes for the last 4 years. Our boards harp about it, and our private letters of instruction teem with it. We must curtail, and curtail, and curtail, until we have sent children whom we had a chance to rescue from vice in its worst forms, back into heathendom, because the church at home couldn't furnish us with the paltry sums of money needed to carry on our work. We met one evening in the mission house, and went over our bills, and planned, and twisted, and turned, and then some of us cried, and said, 'It can't be done. Some of the girls must go from the school. There is nothing more that we can curtail.' Now look at these ladies. I have been studying them all the afternoon. I wish I hadn't. I could almost wish that I might be blind while I am in this country attending missionary meetings, so that I might hear and not see. But my eyes are wide open. What do I see? A lace collar on this side, real lace too. I've not forgotten how the real article looks, costing enough to support one of our girls at school for a year. Silk dresses, 2 of which would give one of our boys a good education. Jewels such as would replenish the entire treasury. Bonnets, oh dear, what would not that row of bonnets bobbing all the afternoon just in front of me have done for our girls' school last year? And the owners of these very bonnets moved gracefully down the aisle and read their pretty little reports about its having been a year of much self-abnegation and earnest effort for the beloved cause. No, I don't want to come back to civilization to live. I know I should suffocate. I would much rather, as a matter of personal comfort, spend my life among the Africans. They are heathen, you know. We don't expect much of them." She had talked very rapidly under the spell of evidently strong excitement, and Mrs. Spafford stood spellbound before her, not knowing what to think or to say, unable to utter a word, relieved indeed from the necessity of doing so, for at that moment 3 members of the executive committee swooped down upon the returned missionary and carried her off in triumph. A captive, to shake hands with scores and scores of pretty ladies in elegant toilets, who were waiting for the honor to be bestowed upon them. Mrs. Spafford stood looking after her in sorrowful silence for a moment, then turned and went slowly down the aisle. She was going home. She could not stay to hear her dear old teacher, Sally Lewis, talk that evening, though the desire to remain was now greatly intensified. But Master Warren had objected to her having an evening out. Indeed, it was through Mrs. Evans's self-sacrifice that she had been enabled to come this afternoon. She must hasten home to relieve her. But she certainly had food for thought. And I do not know that it is any wonder that baby had a very thoughtful, preoccupied sort of mother for companion the rest of the day, nor that he hailed with a crow of delight his father's late homecoming. He came with news. "I meant to be early tonight," he said, bustling about with War mounted on his shoulder. "I was going to smuggle you off downtown with Evans and his wife, and look after this young man myself, but we were detained by special business. Something happened. I'll tell you about it when I get some water. Sit down, young man, until I bring your mamma a pitcher of water. Oh, I saw Joe this afternoon. He says Phyllis will be back tomorrow. She has had her tooth filled and is all right." What had happened was on this wise. Extra work had been the portion of several of the clerks in the great store for the last few weeks, owing to the absence of one of its most trusted employees. He had broken down suddenly in the midst of a busy life, and was reported from day to day as seriously sick. Every morning for 2 weeks Mr. Spafford had heard one or another of the partners remark that it was a great inconvenience to have Holbrook away just now. He was doing well, they believed, but the illness was likely to be tedious. It was almost impossible to supply his place temporarily. Still they could not lose him for considerable, and must hold on as well as they could. Meantime, as the days passed, it was known to but few that Mr. Evans was living a precarious life. His deliberate resignation of his clerkship, with the frank reasons therefor, had caused but a 9 days' wonder among his acquaintances, and had not, of course, caused even a ripple in the great business world, where he was not known at all. He had taken his place in the visible church, and certain members, good earnest men, business men, temperance men, had shaken hands with him and welcomed him with glad words, and assured him of their joy in hearing that he counted not his life dear unto himself, and then they had gone their busy ways. There was no vacancy in their gift. They knew no way in which to help him, save with kind words. Those they gave, and said to one another, when they met for the first few days, that they hoped he would get a good position soon. He ought to. Such backbone as that should be able to make its way in the world. And then they had forgotten him. Others, of the same church, unhesitatingly said that they considered he had been rather faster than was necessary or even modest for so young a Christian. He could at least have felt justified in waiting until the Lord opened some door for him. The man who did not provide for his own household was worse than an infidel, and then they too had forgotten him. During these days the most rigid economy was practiced in the little box of a house. Mrs. Evans, taking lessons of her wifely love and resolute determination to help her husband through this struggle, developed a talent for making palatable dishes out of nothings, that she felt sure even Mrs. Spafford might have envied. Chances here and there the husband found to help hurried men for a day or two, work for which sometimes they paid him in money, and sometimes in hearty thanks and a promise to do the same for him some day when they had leisure. These last he appreciated, but could not pay his rent with them, and the days looked at times heavily shadowed. There was always sunshine for them, though, in the house across the way, and hearty welcomes, and numerous invitations to dinner, to tea, even to breakfast when an excuse could be found. Oh, the ways were constant and quiet and soul-sustaining, which these poor neighbors found to aid each other. Weeks before, Mr. Spafford had presented his friend's name at his own place of business, urging that it might be placed on the list for future vacancies. But the list was long, and the prospect of vacancies exceedingly slight. "I don't know of a probable chance, perhaps in years," had the foreman said to him but the day before. "Of course, sickness may occur, but in that case we wait, as we are doing with Holbrook. He is better, by the way. I hope we shall have him back in a few days." And yet it was only the next morning that, as Mr. Spafford sat at his desk running up a column of figures, a passing clerk paused a moment to say to him, "Did you know that Holbrook was gone?" "Gone where?" And the bewildered clerk tried to remember the sum of the column, and talk at the same time. "Why, his disease took a turn for the worst last night at midnight, and just at daybreak he died." "Is it possible?" And Mr. Spafford was thoroughly aroused. It had not seemed to occur to any one that the man who had sat so long on that high seat, behind that railing, and plodded through such a weary stretch of business, could possibly die. Mr. Spafford sat with pencil poised in air for some minutes, unable to settle down to the routine of work, when so solemn an enemy had invaded their ranks. Yet even while he sat there, his mind went to speculating on the strangeness of the fact that death could come so near, and yet not really touch him. Here was taken from their midst a man beside whom he had sat every working day for 3 months. He would never sit there again, and yet it did not affect his interests, or himself in any sense. How easily could Mr. Spafford think of those, the very suggestion of whose death as possible sent a cold chill to his blood. Human brotherhood is a strange, distant thing after all, he told himself musingly, then bent his head and worked away. It was towards the close of the next day that he was summoned to the private office for an interview with the heads of the firm. "This friend of yours, Mr. Spafford," said the senior, motioning him to a seat, "is he still out of employ?" And receiving an affirmative answer, he added, "Could you conscientiously recommend him to fill the position which you have occupied since you have been in our employ?" With steady lips, but paling face, Mr. Spafford answered, "Yes, sir." Could this mean that they were dissatisfied with him? Never mind, he would do as good a service for his friend as he could. And he forthwith gave as rapid and condensed an account of his peculiar business qualifications as he could. "I think I will try him," said the chief. "If you know his address, Mr. Spafford, you may communicate with him to that effect. We would be glad to see him tomorrow morning. Meantime, you know, of course, of the vacancy in our ranks? Well, sir, we have unanimously elected you to fill the place. To hope that you will prove as faithful to the firm, and to the right, as the one who has fallen, is to wish great things from you." "Callie," her husband said, breaking the little silence which had fallen between them, after the wonderful news had been talked over, "what will our jewel box think of having $300 a year in it?" End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Measuring Sacrifices. Following Mrs. Spafford around during the days when these business changes were taking place was an undertone of doubt and anxiety about mission effort in general, and her own share in it in particular. Her old friend's keen, stinging sentences had remained to burn. Was it child's play? Did the Lord look with sarcasm on it all, and laugh at their pitiful little mimicries of sacrifice? "I will laugh them to scorn," were the Bible words which seemed also to start up and haunt her. She did not look them up and follow out the connection, and thus comfort herself. She had little time for actual study for a few days, so she simply went about her many duties with puzzled face and troubled heart. When, during intervals of care, she dipped into the Bible for a few minutes, She found herself following out the commission, "Go, preach, teach all nations." Be diligent in season and out of season. Present your bodies a living sacrifice. Earnest words, intense words, fully as keen and piercing as any the returned missionary had uttered. She grew to feeling that she had not even been half in earnest. When it really came to the question of sacrifice, how had she shown any personal knowledge of it? As the weeks and months went by, the perplexities of the subject did not lessen. She found herself buying sparingly, perhaps she might almost have said grudgingly, whatever could not be classed among necessities. The pretty carpet which she had thought of with pleasure when she was mentally adorning Mr. Johns's room, cost her actual sighs. What was the use of carpets anyway? Boys and girls in Africa, China, and India perishing, and she buying carpets! And when one morning Mr. Johns asked and obtained permission to bring his nephews out to spend the evening with him, as she made preparations to have a dainty or two added to the evening meal, she felt perplexed over the additional expense. Even the very lumps of coal which she threw on to the grate in the bright parlor cost her a twinge, and she said to herself for the 100th time, "What is right, and where does wrong commence? We might sit in the dining-room." They called it dining-room winter and summer by courtesy, but you will remember that, in winters at least, it was also a kitchen. "I like to have those young men come up to tea, and I like to make the table inviting, and this room is as pretty as a picture in which to receive them. But I could sacrifice all these likes, if I am called upon to do so. Only it would be sacrificing other people's likes also. Am I called upon to make other people's sacrifices for them? And if not, how am I ever to separate myself from other people?" Meantime, her spiritual life was not without its bright hours. She had grown deeply, in fact almost painfully interested in Mr. Johns, a middle-aged man who had buried the wife of his youth and had since been homeless. Perplexed though she was with what appeared to be conflicting duties, she was not sufficiently confused to give over the most thoughtful care and kindness toward this homeless man, and certainly he seemed to appreciate it. He grew daily more interested in matters which were evidently of absorbing interest to Mr. and Mrs. Spafford. He was beginning to be almost as regular at church as they themselves, and for a few weeks past he had joined them at the front door, or at the little gate, or perhaps at the corner, and gone with them to prayer meeting. He always came downstairs for evening worship, and he always lingered for morning prayer. Surely these were cheering signs. Mr. Johns was not a heathen, it is true, in the common acceptation of that word, but Mrs. Spafford's morbid state did not reach to the height of ignoring the individual value of his soul in the sight of God. That it was a morbid state, at least in part, she became almost convinced as time passed. Still, there was enough truth in her difficulty to make her unable to get away from it. The bright-eyed, plain-spoken missionary, who had so confused her sense of the fitness of things, had long since gone on her way, sought after by missionary societies in all directions, to tell to their eager ears the story of her own life, which certainly was full enough of sacrifice, though this she apparently did not realize. But the effect of her intense words, spoken in haste, remained. It was finally to Mrs. Temple that she told the whole story one bright winter day, when she and young Warren went to spend a few hours with that lady. The fact is, all the perplexity came to her with tenfold force, surrounded as she was on every hand by evidences of wealth and expensive tastes. The very carriage, with its luxurious cushions and handsome horses, which had been sent to wait upon her and baby, had given her a questioning twinge. Thinking it all over, she presently turned the conversation in that direction, and found herself telling over to Mrs. Temple her missionary friend's excited words. There were tears in the elder lady's eyes as she listened, but there were smiles on her face. "I've been over the same ground," she declared, to Mrs. Spafford's immense relief. "I know just how it must seem to you, just how the words and thoughts which they suggested have stayed with and tormented you. Never mind, dear, don't grudge the unrest they have caused you. They will bear fruit. Meantime, there are two sides, even to your earnest friend's words. She, from her standpoint, sees plainly one side, but not the other. I think she feels and talks very much as the Lord Jesus Christ would have done, had he turned away in despair and disgust from those poor fishermen who thought they were leaving all to follow him. What did they leave, after all? What sacrifices did they make? Yet they thought they were making great ones. And in what infinite patience he bore with them, and led them along step by step, until the time came when they counted not their lives dear. I don't think they would have been ready for martyrdom that first day when he called them from their nets. Poor human sight would have felt utterly discouraged with them many a time between that day and the one in which they went up to him through fire and blood. So the church is growing. Some of our dear Christian ladies have but just heard a faint echo of his call, "Go ye into all the world," though it has been sounding for centuries. There are many of them standing now on the threshold, dazed with the echo, scarcely knowing if it can possibly mean them, and seeing sacrifice and burden where one day they will "count it all joy." And only he can seem to bear patiently with childish footsteps, and wait for growth and strength. Besides, dear Mrs. Spafford, there are two sides even to their dresses and bonnets sometimes. I happen to know the private history of one of that very group of bonnets which your friend saw and deplored. It was bought at an uptown store, where a pretty young girl is just struggling up into position, trying amid great competition to establish herself. To secure Mrs. Jason Ward's custom, to make her a bonnet of such material and in such a fashion that others of Mrs. Ward's set would look and admire and follow example, was an advertisement for the struggling young woman which she will not soon forget. Indeed, I sometimes think that that very bonnet is going to bring that pretty, new milliner into the kingdom. Then beside her sat Mrs. McChesney in an elegant new black silk. She read a report that day, you will remember. When she referred to sacrifices, I could barely hide a smile at the smallness of my own thoughts. I was wondering whether she had really felt it a little sacrifice to have that dress made by Mrs. Dormer, a widow who is a neat and skillful sewer, and is trying hard to secure work such as will enable her to keep her children together and educate them. She made this dress, did it well, is capable of doing well, and yet I know that Mrs. McChesney likes to go to Lawrence and Newcomb's old established house. They have always done her work, and suit her exactly, without any trouble. Still, she didn't go there. And what is the result? Why, ladies of her acquaintance said to one another, "Did you know that Mrs. McChesney's new black silk was made by Mrs. Dormer? She must have a very high opinion of her work if she gives her such an elegant silk as that." And forthwith custom pours in upon Mrs. Dormer. It is as good as $100 advertisement to her. And I will tell you in confidence that Mrs. Dormer brought me around a $5 bill only last week as a thank-offering to the special fund in our Foreign Missionary Society. I know Mrs. McChesney is more interested in that society than in any other, said poor Mrs. Dormer. She herself had never thought of the heathen twice in her life, but she continued, "So I thought I would bring it, for I do feel so thankful to her. She is coming to the next meeting, Mrs. Dormer is, you understand, and who can tell whereunto this may grow?" Now that is a glimpse of the other side. I don't say that it is or it isn't the best way to manage these things, but what I do say is that the Lord sees the heart, and little seeds of loving kindness to one's neighbor, whether he be next door or across the ocean, may be in many hearts unknown to us, unknown to those grand missionaries who have gotten above us so far that they see all the glory of the work and the honor of being allowed to toil, but not so high up that they can see into each human heart and accept the petty sacrifices and watch the growing seed and wait for harvest. "Still," said Mrs. Temple, as the talk went on, "there is her side too, and we must not forget it. There are thoughtless expenditures among wealthy Christian women. There are hundreds lavished where tens would do. That cannot be denied, and we do well to look thoughtfully and prayerfully at it from this missionary's standpoint, and by realizing what a ridiculous sarcasm our lives present to her, get a glimpse of what motiveless and unconsecrated expenditure must look like to God, who gave Himself for souls." "That is it," said Mrs. Spafford, setting War down again on the rug, and standing before her friend, her face aglow with feeling. "Leaving all these people who have plenty of money, and with whose expenditures I have nothing to do, how am I to regulate my own life? I am in great confusion." Then she dropped back into the low easy-chair, and, led on by tender questioning, began to tell all about her trivial perplexities, the new carpet, the extra dishes, even the parlor fire, and the nephews. "Two sides, dear friend," said Mrs. Temple, still smiling. "You will need to learn that by heart. When the disciples were commissioned to preach the gospel to every creature, they were to begin in Jerusalem. Now think a moment. Suppose you, instead of going over on that rainy afternoon 2 years ago, and helping to reconstruct, not only Mrs. Evans's kitchen, but her home — oh yes, I know all about it. Mrs. Evans is also a friend of mine, remember. But suppose instead you had worked a collar for the store, which would bring eventually $1 into the treasury of the Lord. In actual dollars and cents, how would it have compared? How much in dollars has Mrs. Evans been worth to the mission band, her influence dating from that day? How much may she be worth in the future? What may her husband do? I think he has commenced grandly. Did you know he subscribed $10 to the Young Men's Fund for Bibles for Mexico? And you know surely that he believes you and your husband were the means of showing him Christ. Do you believe you could have done it by saving your time and your money for the foreign mission treasury? Then I think the Lord has important work for Mr. Johns to do. And your pretty home, yes, and the pretty parlor, and all the purity and peace of his surroundings, may be the Master's cords of influencing, drawing him. As for those 2 nephews, I don't believe you know that they are in Mr. Temple's Bible class, and that they are evidently giving serious thought to the all-important questions. The older one, Charlie, told my husband about his visit at your home, and about the delightful evening which you gave them, and a hint of some thoughtful, earnest words that you spoke to him under the gaslight. He admitted to Mr. Temple that if he thought he could be such a Christian as you and your husband were, he would like to be one. I tell you, dear, the Lord knows you, knows just what place he has set you in, just how many people you can touch with your influence, and just what he is going to do with them all. And he loves the cause, both at home and abroad, more than you and I can." "But what about the sacrifice?" said Mrs. Spafford, after a thoughtful pause, during which her face had lighted greatly. "I don't quite understand that. 'Give till you feel it' is the sentence I read the other day, that should be taken as a motto by all the Christian world. I don't know how to do it. As I have been telling you, my actions seem to be so mixed with other people that I cannot separate them. How am I to sacrifice for any cause?" Mrs. Temple bent toward the rug and gave herself up apparently to the pleasure of a frolic with War, his happy shouts and evident appreciation of the fun drawing his mother's pleased attention. When her gaze was riveted on him, with the mother love shining fully in her eyes, Mrs. Temple said suddenly, "What a heavy sacrifice your life has been during the past year for the sake of this one little boy! How many nights have you sat by his crib? How many hours have you walked the floor with him in your arms? How many comforts have you gone without for his sake? In short, how continually you must have felt the weight of self-sacrifice for him. Can you compute it, Mrs. Spafford?" A quick telegraphic dispatch from the heart of one woman to the other was the immediate result of this sentence. Then the mother bent and kissed her baby. "I do not feel the utmost that I can do for him to be a sacrifice," she said, with deep feeling, "because I love him so. Do you mean, Mrs. Temple? Can I think—" "Do I think you can so love Christ that whatever sacrifices of personal ease or comfort you may make for his sake will become so much a joy as to cease to be claimed under the head of sacrifice? Aye, indeed, there is a higher plane than that of sacrifice." There was much more talk, but I cannot give it to you. Its sum is embodied in Mrs. Spafford's words as she wrapped War's cloak around him and tied his gay cap under his chin. "Thank you, Mrs. Temple. You do not know what you have done for me this afternoon. I don't know myself yet, but I feel sure that I am a great deal richer than I was when I came." Then immediately, "Mrs. Temple, you need not have ordered the carriage for us. We could go home by car." Mrs. Temple laughed pleasantly. "Are you afraid, dear," she said, "that to luxuriate in a carriage, instead of being uncomfortable in a car, is not making use of your opportunities for sacrifice? Save your car fare for the mission mite box, and ride with a clear conscience. John, on his way up for you, dropped Mrs. Perkins, you know. She doesn't get rides often, and needs them. John is going to stop for her on his way back and bring her home. So you see, you may safely enjoy the carriage." Mrs. Spafford responded by a happy little laugh. "I don't think anything about comfort or sacrifice," she protested. "I was just planning to stop on the way and do an errand." "Do all the errands you want to. Mrs. Perkins will be in no haste to get home, and John will make love to War with all his heart while you are gone." Notwithstanding her protest, Mrs. Spafford found her heart rejoicing over the fact that she could see work that Christ would own, even connected with that luxurious carriage. Had he not said, "Unto one of the least of these"? Mrs. Perkins ranked among the least as the world looked at it, but she was assuredly one of his own. War was left for a brief minute, cuddled among the cushions, talking to John, while his mother stopped at one of the great stores, summoned the carpet clerk, Mr. Johns, and directed him to bring the nephews home with him to supper. Then she hastened home, set the parlor aglow with beauty with the aid of a large bouquet, brought from Mrs. Temple's greenhouse, then beguiled Phyllis into entertaining War while she made cream muffins for tea. New light had dawned on her pathway, new meaning there was in the verse, "Whether therefore ye eat, or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God." She saw new ways of doing it. She was gleefully happy over the muffins. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Then and Now. What an immense book the history of a human life would make! Probably no one will ever know how large a volume it would be, for no one will ever write it. I have lingered over the story of the beginnings of married life, to this my friend Mrs. Spafford. She is so dear to me, and her early trials and triumphs are such vivid pictures in my heart, that I love to linger over them. But time hastened. Therefore I, warned by the growing chapters, will ask you to look in upon her busy life for the last time, nearly 10 years from the day in which you made her acquaintance. Not in the pretty little box of a home. Those quarters grew too strait for the increasing family. It is on the same square, however. The Spaffords found themselves much too attached to their surroundings, the ties of the neighborhood too strong to be causelessly sundered. So it stands on the corner below, a large, handsome house, plain, it is true, but it is the plainness of exceeding taste and care, rather than that of accident. Perhaps the most noticeable feature is the lovely lawn that spreads itself abroad in almost uncity-like greenness and beauty. Grasses and ferns and flowers cluster here all summer in radiant freshness. Lovely beds of violets are scattered here and there. Lilies of the valley in their early season hide under broad, green leaves, while in shady nooks certain beauties of the woods thrive exceedingly, to prove the falsity of the popular notion that none of these wildwood treasures will bear transplanting and petting. On the opposite corner is a twin house, the ground distinguished from their neighbor across the way only by a lavish wealth of roses during June. The houses themselves are as nearly alike as the same architect and builder could make them, and I presume you can readily guess that the Evans family occupy the latter one. The neighbors of years ago are neighbors still. I want you, on this bright winter afternoon, to go with me to the meeting of the Young Ladies' Mission Band. You will meet many of the old friends there, and some new ones, and get perhaps a better idea of what is doing in that branch than a half-day's story from me could give you. It is not necessary to climb the hill to the old Stowell homestead. The parlor served its time, doing its duty nobly, and has retired into private life again. For, 6 squares away from the 2 stone houses where our friends live, is another new building. In point of fact, there are many new buildings, for this part of the city has grown so rapidly during the last 6 years that it cannot honestly lay claim longer to the name suburb. But there is one pile of brick and mortar which is the building above all others, around which the hopes and plans of many center. It is large, and in fact rather imposing looking, and bears over its central door, in large letters, this brief statement: Young Ladies' Band, Temple Street Church. To the initiated, these words tell a great deal, and as for the uninitiated, can't they inquire? This building is the property of the Temple Street Church. It holds within its ample walls a reference library on missions, a general library of carefully selected volumes, a ladies' parlor, handsomely furnished, where women and girls may be sure of meeting at all hours of the day some Christian women who will greet them cordially, introduce them to the points to which they may need introduction, give them any needed help as regards work, or home, or friends, in short, set them in the way of helping themselves. A ladies' committee room just across the hall, where some of the various committees of Christian work are apt to be in session on almost any day of the week. A coffee and lunch room for women only, constantly presided over by skillful young women who have been taught how to prepare wholesome and inviting food. A young ladies' parlor, carpeted and curtained and seated tastefully, a parlor organ at one end, a center table with Bible and hymn books, and numerous side tables with work baskets and a sewing machine near at hand. This last is where the young ladies hold their monthly gatherings, and downstairs the largest room in the building, with bay windows at front and side, in which of each glitter in gilt letters the word "What Not," the fancy store belonging still to the stock company formed more than 8 years ago. Every other room in the building is connected with the benevolence of the Temple Street Church, save this one. This is rented at a fair figure, and paid for in quarterly advance payments by the members of this unique firm. They are still firmly resolved on not mixing things. Business is business, and benevolence is benevolence. True, they find no fault because the managers of the building choose to use the rent paid them for this room to swell the number of volumes in the library. They have no desire to curtail the benevolent enterprises of the Temple Street Church. On the contrary, they rejoice over each one. They are grateful for the bestowal of the committee room, and the parlor, and the library, and the upper parlor where they hold their religious meetings. This is benevolence. They gave their mites to help build each of these. They constantly help to keep the wheels in motion, but the downstairs front room means business. They are workers. They have enlarged their borders. The store is open now all day long, from Monday morning until Saturday night, always excepting Wednesday and Friday evenings, when occur the regular church prayer meetings. Well-salaried clerks are in constant attendance, but the numerous partners keep a sharp lookout and hold themselves carefully posted as to all that goes on connected with the firm. That it has paid, and is paying, you need only glance up and down the well-stocked room to be sure of. I shall not even venture to whisper to you what have been the net receipts during this past year. The fact is, it is a business secret. What firm of any importance cares to noise abroad its financial power? Yet that some people understand it is evident, because you may hear it repeatedly affirmed by leading business men in the very heart of the great city, that they should not hesitate to trust the what-not to any reasonable amount. It is true, this may be owing in part to the fact that the firm in question never ask 1 cent of credit from any business house anywhere, their rules in this respect being as strict as when they invested with laughter and trembling their first $6.75. Well, I did not propose to have you linger in the store. You are invited up to the young ladies' parlor, where the meeting is in progress. At first sight, it will not impress you at all as a religious meeting. The machine is hushed, it is true, but needles and scissors and thimbles are flashing and gleaming in busy fingers, and tongues are moving almost as steadily. Mrs. Spafford is seated at the central table, and the Bible is open before her. Mrs. Evans is at her right, pencil and notebook in hand. Every other lady in the room is sewing, or crocheting, or knitting, or cutting. These two, Mrs. Spafford and Mrs. Evans, it will be remembered, are not young ladies, but there is a singular fact connected with their history thus far. Not a young lady belonging to that band has discovered apparently that these two are any older, or are ever to be any older, than those who rank among young ladies. They have held to them with a calm persistence that has so shamed old Father Time, that he really has retired into the background, leaving no wrinkles, and as yet not even a suggestive gray hair. And every lady in the church knows that these two motherly matrons are main arteries of the young ladies' band. Mrs. Spafford, though with an open Bible before her, repeats, instead of reads, this sentence: "Ask of me, and I will give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession." And without a pause of a moment, Mrs. Evans adds, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof." And Addie Stowell says, "Thou shalt inherit all nations." Thus the story grows, the wonderful story of God's own promises, which are found to belt the earth, proving by his mighty word that all the nations of the earth shall yet praise him. It is Laura Bacon who has dropped the bright wools she was sorting, and slipped into a seat before the organ, just as the triumphant chorus of verses is concluded. She touches the chords, and with one consent they chant, "The Lord reigneth, let the earth rejoice, let the multitude of isles be glad thereof. Declare his glory among the heathen, his wonders among all nations. O come, let us worship and bow down, let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." At the first note of the song, the busy hands drop, and with the closing strain the ladies kneel, and Mrs. Evans's voice leads them into the very presence of the God of the whole earth. "It almost seems as if the day were near at hand when all the inhabitants of the earth shall worship him," declared Addie Stowell, when work had been resumed. "I have been so astonished over many facts while getting ready for this meeting." "That must certainly mean good news from China," said Mrs. Evans with a smile. "I believe you are her special representative for today." "Oh, China is simply wonderful! You ought to have appointed every one of us to represent her, and then we couldn't have begun to do her justice. I don't know about this general summary that we are supposed to give in January. Why, we can't begin to glance at the wonders that are doing." "Well, just a glance is about all we can give, but I think if you remember that we are to glance backward as well as forward, you will succeed in impressing us by the power of contrast." "Yes'm, I remember it, and it was that very thing that overwhelmed me. Why, Mrs. Spafford, I didn't know that less than 40 years ago there were only 6 Chinamen converted. Isn't that awful?" "It is harder for me to realize that any of them are converted now," declared a gay young girl. "I don't know much about the Chinese, only their faces look so funny and their ways are so unlike ours, it doesn't seem as though they could be Christians. Do many of them come to the light? You know I have just joined your ranks, you must wink at my ignorance." "And enlighten it, Fanny," said Mrs. Evans, laughing. "Addie, can you encourage her in regard to the Chinese?" "I should think so! Why, there are 50,000 of them connected with Christian churches. Only think of that! Over 13,000 of them are communicants. And, Fanny Carley, how much do you suppose those church members give a year for the cause? $20,000! Just think of it! Heathen, indeed! I wish some of them would come over and teach our civilized heathen how to give. Mrs. Spafford, how much may I say? I am just bubbling over. There are dozens of curious incidents that I'd like to tell." "Save them for February," ruled Mrs. Spafford. "You know we give the entire meeting to China then, and I can see by Minnie Stuart's face that she thinks the Chinese don't compare with the Mexicans." This suggestion brought a chorus of eager voices to the front. Every one of the girls had been, at a very recent date, to hear that queen of Mexican missions, Mrs. Rankin. 4 copies of her book were in the missionary library, and had been carefully read, since the excitement about her wonderful work had reached white heat, and the girls were therefore on the qui vive to give information. At least such was the case with those who represented Mexico, while the others were equally certain that these should be held to the rules, and give only a summary. "Well," declared Minnie, "we are willing. The summary is astonishing enough, especially in the light of contrast. Remember how Miss Rankin worked to get one Bible over into Mexico, and how she rejoiced when that feat was accomplished? And then think of the Protestant churches scattered over it today, and the thousands there who are followers of Christ." This very sentence produced eager words from one and another in confirmation of the remarkable changes in that land, which a few years had wrought. And at last Mrs. Spafford was again obliged to call them to order. "I don't think it can be that our time is up. We are just hurried because Essie is determined to get to India," declared Minnie Stuart, as she laughingly retired to the background. "Well, India is fully as startling in its story as China or Mexico can possibly be," affirmed the earnest-faced young girl whom they called Essie. "Don't you know when we were reading Dr. Judson's life, we concluded that no other mission land could be more hopeless than India looked then? Now think of there being 78,000 people there who belong to Jesus. I tell you, girls, that number is simply glorious. Mamma laughed at my enthusiasm when I found it out. I was a little ashamed of the way in which I shouted. But it came over me suddenly, and I just broke my thoughts. 'Oh, oh, oh,' I said, 'what an immense throng there is going to be in heaven, when India alone is ready now to send 78,000. Still, the more I studied the matter, the more evident it was that there was a great deal to do yet. Why, some of the sentences in the book I was reading sounded just like sarcasm, though they were not intended for that. For instance, it stated that there are now in India 2 missionaries for every 1,000,000 of inhabitants, and that this was a very good number. Mrs. Spafford, what do you think of that, when you said the other day that our pastor, with a congregation of 1,000 to look after, had far too much to do?" "Just what I thought before, Essie," said Mrs. Spafford, smiling, "that we expect more of our pastors than they can accomplish with such large fields, and that we are awfully neglecting India, as well as every other mission field." "Yes," declared a champion for China, "I am glad you put in that last, Mrs. Spafford. I don't think India compares with China, for instance, in this need. Why, that missionary who visited at Auntie's last summer told me herself that, where she was located, the number of people that one missionary had to reach, if they were reached, was the same as though there were a minister in New York City and one in Cleveland, and none between. She asked me how I should enjoy having my minister have such a field as that." Thus the talk went on. Siam and Africa and Japan and Persia and Syria had each their special champion, eager to give contrasting figures and striking bits of news. Constantly was their leader obliged to suppress the enthusiastic young hearts, hinting that this was the day for the general outlook only, and that each field would come up in its turn for special notice. Only once did they break the line of actual review of facts, to romance a little over what the future might bring them. This was when they reached the last month of the year, and Syria was called for. Then all eyes were turned, with a sort of tender eagerness, on the blushing face of Lena Bacon. "Mrs. Spafford, you will certainly let Lena talk as long as she wants to?" pleaded 2 or 3 voices, and Mrs. Spafford, smiling, albeit the tears were very near the surface, declared her willingness to listen to whatever Lena had to say. But she, blushing, smiling, could at first say nothing at all. The simple truth was, she was on the eve of passing beyond the realm of mere saying into the actual personal doing in the faraway land. Aye, Mrs. Spafford's mission band were to have a missionary of their very own, sent out from their home and hearts. And, in the strange sweet providence of God, this was none other than Lena Bacon, she whom you will possibly remember as one who declared frankly, on the day of this band's organization, that she "did not believe in foreign missions." The Lord holdeth the hearts of his people. Lena was, despite this childish folly, one of his own, and in his time he set the very inmost longing of her heart of hearts on the work abroad, and called her to prepare to drop seed there. And she was going, in her youth and beauty, sacrificing, so it looked to others, with no meager hand, since she had everything to leave that this world can give. But never did young heart sacrifice more loyally or joyfully. And Mrs. Bacon, her mother, had moved step by step during this term of years, from an actual opposer to a silent looker-on, then to a faint and distant follower, then to one who read, in silvery voice and well-chosen sentences, beautiful reports about sacrifice, and gave annually her hundreds, without knowing that they were gone, or caring greatly what they did, then suddenly had stepped into the very forefront of sacrifice, learning by the deep throbbings of her mother heart what the word meant, for she was giving her only darling. And she did give her, not without a struggle at first, not without counting the cost with tearful protests, again and again and again, but she had already come to know that sacrifice for Christ is sweet, and that he has a special and very tender place for those who give to them their best. So now, where her body, and in a degree her purse, had been for several years, the workers in Temple Street Church recognized that she brought her soul. And in a few months more Lena was going. Not alone. Oh, no. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Pocket Measure by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Good Measure. Not alone, in any sense of the word. The all-reaching promise, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world," had sounded down to her through the ages, and felt to her heart as though he who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, had spoken the word but yesterday to her individual need. Not alone as regarded human love and care, for she had been chosen by one who counted it a special and crowning mercy of the Master whom he served, that just she and no other in all the world had been called to walk with him on his life's journey. Are you interested to know who this other was? Do you remember the nephew, Charlie, and the muffins for tea, and the extra lumps of coal in the grate, and the buffetings of Satan which Mrs. Spafford endured on their account, when he whispered in her ear, "To what purpose is this waste? These lumps of coal might have been saved, and thus the money which must now be taken to buy other lumps have been dropped into your mite box to swell the general fund." His wretched attempts to appear as an angel of light were long since silenced by a word from the Master, which Mrs. Spafford took to him as her answer. "In the morning sow thy seed, and in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good." And now, behold, he had indeed prospered, aye, and given already a tenfold harvest. For it was Charlie, the nephew who was going in a few months to carry on her work, right in the center of the field, while she worked still at home. Only a few months before he had graduated and had been ordained to preach the everlasting gospel. Truly, there are times in which God proves that a day with him is as 1,000 years. Looking back upon the story of her past, Mrs. Spafford marveled sometimes that even God could work so fast, or bring such wondrous things to pass. Not the least among her joys was the fact that the one who had quietly borne all the expense of Charlie's education and outfit for his faraway field was the carpet clerk, Mr. Johns. "He is my contribution to foreign missions," the widower was apt to say, with a humorous shake of his gray head, when the church hinted its desire to share some of the honor with him. "Charlie is my contribution. Mrs. Spafford was always asking me to give to foreign missions the very money that I had been saving up for Charlie. I wanted to please her, and I wanted him to have the money, and so I just made up my mind to lump it. Charlie belongs to me." Ah, yes, with limitations. Long before this had Mr. Johns recognized and bowed before a higher ownership both for Charlie and himself. But with a price. And the day in which he and Charlie stood together in the church, and gave public recognition of this eternal ownership, was one of the happiest in Mrs. Spafford's life. Could she do other than rejoice that he had said to them in private, "I told the Lord, Mr. Spafford, that you and your wife had brought in this worthless old sheaf, as well as the younger one, who I think will yet bring others with him. The Lord knows it is true, and he knows that with you to show me how, I mean to try to go home not entirely empty-handed." There was no danger of it. More than one gem already sparkles in the crown set aside and waiting for that gray head. Now, during this long retrospect of ours, the Young Ladies' Missionary Meeting has gone steadily on. As I said, they ran off their track with Lena long enough to launch out in a dozen questions as to what she meant to do about this and that and the other. And she, as entirely and happily at home with them as though they had been her sisters in the flesh, gave ready answers, and took sweet counsel with them, realizing that there was between them a bond of union stronger than death, and strengthening with every passing day. This talk in no wise unfitted them for the 10 minutes of prayer, in which nearly every lady in that room gave audible expression to her love for Christ and his cause, and her desire that their special treasure Lena might be upborne by his everlasting arm. Then they sang, "Blessed be the tie that binds," and the January meeting was over. "How do you get it to sound so little like a meeting?" questioned an interested visitor one day. "Why, I mean, you know, the absence of all formality is so striking. They just talk away as though they were having a good time, and yet they are thoroughly well prepared. It cannot be just a chance conversation which they hold." "Yes, it is," declared Mrs. Evans. "That is, if you please to call it so. The young ladies prepare themselves with great thoroughness, taking time and care, and then the mere words in which they clothe their thoughts for the meeting are as much chance as yours are when you remark to me that it is an unusually cold day. As a matter of fact, you have observed the weather before this, consulted a thermometer it may be, compared the weather report of this date with the corresponding one of last year. In other words, you have perhaps prepared yourself to give an intelligent and correct estimate of the weather, but the words in which you make the statement are entirely unstudied." "I understand," the visitor said, "but still I don't see how you ever get them to study up and be ready, nor how they contrive to appear so natural and unconstrained about it when they are ready." "They will not study until they are interested and have something to study for. It is the result of long training. Mrs. Spafford has simply been indefatigable in that, as in everything else that she undertakes, and she has had Mrs. Temple to consult and lead her on. Her custom for years had been to give a mission station to a certain number of girls for 3 months. They are supposed to post themselves thoroughly about that station, and whatever question we may chance to ask of them concerning it, if they cannot answer, and it is answerable, they are expected to be ready with the item the next time they meet us. At the end of 3 months they change, each taking another field. In this way all the girls, except the quite new ones, have had each of the stations. So of course they know a good deal about them. And there is always a sort of pride in standing up for the country to which one happens to belong for the time being. As for the unconstrained, they feel no constraint, so of course exhibit none. They have been trained to talk on this topic exactly as they discuss the weather or the fashions, or the last book they have read. You notice that they continue their work, except during the strictly devotional exercises, and the talk is frequently interrupted by a call for the scissors, or the canvas, or the blue or red or green silk. Mrs. Spafford, after careful study, became convinced that this informal way of managing the matter, allowing the interruptions that would naturally occur in common conversation, was the best way of helping the girls to feel at home and informal. It has worked well. Now I have given you, as I promised, just a glimpse of the young ladies' band. It could really be only a glimpse, for I have neither time nor ability to let you at once into the inner workings of this carefully planned and skillfully officered scheme. No general of an army, planning his campaign, could work more steadily, patiently, and with a more single eye to victory, than did the mature brains that had taken hold with these young things to do battle for the Lord. To be sure, they had many helpers now, among the young people themselves. A few years really makes veterans of people who are in earnest, and a number of those who had taken hold of the work as quite young girls remained as mature young ladies to drill with the new recruits, who were constantly gathering. Many had married and gone out from them, it is true, but enough of the old material remained to keep the business part of the enterprise from ever being the ponderous and somewhat hazardous experiment that it was when Mrs. Spafford first put her shoulder to the wheel. Meantime, that lady's afternoon work was by no means finished with the close of the meeting. She hastened home as soon as she could break away from groups of talkers who all had questions of immediate importance to press. She had a good reason to make haste, for she was well aware that another missionary meeting was in progress, which was liable by this time to need her immediate attention. I trust you have not forgotten young Warren Spafford. He has arrived at an age in which it is not easy to forget any boy who is within reasonable distance, and young Warren was by no means the sort of boy to sink into oblivion. No meek and quiet spirit was he, but a vigorous, loud-voiced, quick-witted, wide-awake fellow, as you will be likely to find at 8 years of age. He was a boy who developed constantly in the line of schemes. Daring ones, intricate in their nature, were constantly appearing to him to be worked up. Some of these plans were practical, and others were decidedly and hopelessly the reverse. But of this last he would never be convinced by previous experience. Each individual plan had to be carefully tried before he was ready to abandon it. His last experiment had been a missionary meeting among the boys, suddenly projected on his mother without word of warning. 3 gatherings had been held, and with a code of laws that, to say the least, was original, and a program that was unique, enthusiasm was still at white heat. His mother, looking on, wondering whether this was really seed springing up on fertile soil, or a dream that would come to naught, did what she could to encourage the small people, and bided her time. "If I had only planned it for him," she told herself, smiling over some of the quaint plans which she had not made, "perhaps it might really have developed well. But how could I plan when the queer little fellow started it up suddenly, apparently full-fledged? Never mind, out of the mouths of babes he has ordained praise. Perhaps this will grow to his praise." One thing seemed certain, that if he lived, Warren Spafford would in some way fulfill the hopes of his babyhood. For if his enthusiasm could be said to center on any one thing, and hold itself with an ever-increasing fervor, that thing was the world of missions. Standing at the front window of the house opposite her own was a pale-faced, hollow-eyed, discontented-looking woman. If you had been near to her, you would not have had to look very closely to trace lines of unrest, many and heavily marked, on her white, dreary face. She had aged in the passing years far more than the other ladies, which possibly you will not think strange when I tell you she is Jenny Coleman, and that she has come to live with her cousin, Mrs. Evans. That last sentence gives you a hint at least of family disunion and trouble. Speedy as Mrs. Spafford's transit had been, her neighbor had reached home before her, and was upstairs now, ready to have Mrs. Coleman's ceaseless observations on passers-by poured at her. "There is Callie! I wonder why she persists in wearing that cloak. It is too short for the present style, and never became her very well either. But then I know why she wears it, just because she is too penurious to get another. That is just like Callie Spafford, and it was just like Callie Howell. I should think that she might remember now that she is a rich woman, but it is inborn, that trait in her character. She is just as careful and economical as when she was first married and lived in that little old house. Do you remember that day we met her at the store, and she wouldn't buy asparagus because it was so expensive? Well, I met her downtown yesterday, and pointed out some elegant hothouse grapes to her. They were so lovely, they fairly made my mouth water. And do you believe she wouldn't buy them? She said they were out of season, and so expensive that she must not look their way. The idea of her talking that way, and her husband a partner in one of the largest houses in the city." Mrs. Evans laughed. Once her face would have flushed, and her eyes flashed over this sort of comment on her friend, but she had learned at last to live away above Jenny's unwearied tongue, accounting it as not of the smallest consequence, save to her own bitter heart, what the poor tongue kept saying. "I suppose she thinks she must be conscientious in the use of money, even though she has considerable," she said pleasantly. "Oh, conscientious! That's all nonsense!" vehemently declared Mrs. Coleman. She was born so, and cannot help it, I tell you. It is just as natural for her to save it as to breathe, and I must say I think it is an exceedingly unbecoming trait. It did well enough when she was poor, but in her present circumstances it is very noticeable. You are not naturally that way, Eva. I don't think as a girl you were in the least penurious, but you are so fond of copying Callie Spafford that I tremble for you. It is growing real hard for you to buy anything that you can do without. Such a low, poverty-stricken position to take when there is no matter of occasion. Now, when we consider the fact that Mrs. Evans was daily spending money for the care and comfort of this, her homeless cousin, she might perhaps be pardoned for feeling the plain words a trifle, but they provoked from her only a smile. They were actually too foolish to feel. Oh, you must remember that Mr. and Mrs. Spafford frequently prove the fact that they have money by the way in which they give it, if they don't by spending, she said, speaking lightly. Oh, give! I am not likely to forget it. That is another hobby of theirs which they ride to death. I think it is quite as silly an extreme as the other. The idea of the Spaffords giving $200 to the collection for foreign missions in addition to all that she does in the band. It is perfectly absurd. Millionaires don't do much more than that. It is nothing but pride. Scrimp and save to see how much they can give. That is another thing in which you and Dane are copying as hard as you can. I don't see how Dane can do it. He seems to be independent enough about some things. You never were independent, Eva, but I wouldn't tie myself down to any copy if I were you. That is really what I am trying to do, said Mrs. Evans, sweetly and simply. He is our pattern, you know. Dane and I both want to copy him very closely. Oh, pshaw, said Mrs. Coleman, giving an impatient twitch to her shoulders, her whole face gathering in a frown. She called all such words cant. After a moment of irritable silence, she went back to the charge. I declare, I believe Callie Spafford is a monomaniac on giving, and she is bringing up her child to be just like her. He has a rosewood box perched on the mantel in his own room, and he took me in to see it the other night, and talked to me about his tenths as largely as though he were a merchant prince, for all the world like his father. Earning money he is, too, like the child of a day laborer. Well, Callie was a queer girl in every respect, and she has certainly made a queer woman. Then the flow of talk was interrupted by a long-drawn sigh, and after a moment she added in a low, dreary voice, It is a strange world. Think of you two girls beginning life as poor as you did, and your husbands in just these few years on the way to being rich men, while I am a miserable, wrecked woman, no home, no husband, no friends. And the talk ended, as it so often did, in a burst of sobs. Poor Jenny Coleman! It was of no avail to attempt consolation. Mrs. Evans knew this by past experience only too well. At such times, words only seemed to have power to irritate. She was deeply, painfully sorry for her cousin. But there was no truthful way of saying so, without leaving at least the inference that much of the fault of her wretched life was her own. No husband! Not that the grave had closed over him. Mrs. Evans could not fail to see that the unloving wife would have been better pleased if it had. The unwearied exertions of Dane Evans and Mr. Spafford had at last prevailed, and the wreck of the once perfect gentleman, Will Coleman, had consented to shut himself inside the walls of an inebriate asylum. Whether he would ever come back into the world of men, a saved man, God only knew. One of the hardest features of it all was, that his miserable, disappointed wife not only had no hope of him, but did not seem to want to have. Thinking of it all, of the eagerness of this young couple to be rich, of the strides towards it which they thought themselves making, of the family across the way and the almost unbroken tide of prosperity that had flowed in upon them since the hour when they held to principle rather than to bread, if there must a choice be made, thinking of their own signal leading, and of the wonderful tenths which God had given to both families in these last years, Mrs. Evans thought, but by no means said, "There is that maketh himself rich, yet hath nothing. There is that maketh himself poor, yet hath great riches." Was that verse written for the purpose of giving to the world a history of these three families? When will the world by observation learn wisdom? "Mamma," said young Warren, his cheeks very red, his eyes aglow, "we made a thank-offering to-day. I told the boys about your thank-offering in the band, you know, and they liked it, and they each gave a cent more than their tenths, and you know the gold dollar that Uncle Dane gave me for my birthday? Well, I gave the half of that for a thank-offering. We gave it because we are all so happy and having a grand time. Wasn't that a good reason, Mamma?" A thoughtful pause, during which the bright, dark eyes took on a gleam, as though within the soul was born some great resolve, and then he said, "Mamma, I am going to pray to Jesus to make me well enough off when I am a man, so that I can give half of my money for thank-offerings. I mean half of what is left after the tenths are taken out. Of course I'd give them. They belong. But I want to give something, you know, besides what belongs. And there'll be enough things to be thankful for, won't there?" Looking down into his eager face and smiling eyes, the mother stooped and kissed him, once and again, and repeated aloud to herself rather than him, that old-time promise having this seal: "I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete withal, it shall be measured to you again." End of chapter 29. End of The Pocket Measure by Pansy. Recording by Trisha G. Thanks for listening.